you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Well, thank you.
In every way. It's great. What we'd like to do to always get started, perhaps you noticed that in some of the things that you read, is to just take, a short period of time and help who's ever listening, reading this, have a sense of how you come to it. It's not just what we know. It's like, how do we come to know that? What's driving our passion, our learning? Where are we coming from before we start saying what we know? How did we get there? So a sketch of that.
Okay. Well, I started my teaching in a parochial school, and I went on to public schools, and my first class in public schools was a 7th grade class, and I had 2 groups, and I taught them what we called core in those days: language arts, science, and social studies, correlated studies. And many of the children in my class could not read well. So I knew I needed to go back to school to finish some certification requirements and so forth. And it became clear that what I really needed to know more about was how to deal with these children's reading difficulties. So that's what I did. That caused me to go into reading, to begin the master's program in reading. Shortly after that, I became the reading specialist at this junior high school, and went on from there to a variety of positions. I've worked at the state level as the reading specialist. I've worked at the national level on the National Assessment for Educational Progress in Reading, and at the Council for Chief State School Officers as their reading specialist there. And here I am at NEA working again for advocacy around reading and children's access to the opportunity to be not only just good readers, but thoughtful, informed readers. And that's important to me.
Excellent. So you had a first-hand experience as a teacher in dealing with children who weren't ready to go on because of their difficulties with reading.
Exactly.
And that personally, passionately kind of inspired you to learn your way into being helpful to them.
Absolutely.
That's great. I always like to find where somebody's heart is and how they get to where they go.
Oh, yes.
As a kind of basis. Tell me about there's a number of things that we want to cover, but tell me about your role here at the NEA and what your message is to teachers and to the American education system as a whole relative to reading.
Okay. And actually, I'll give you a little history as this rolls out. When I first came to NEA, there was no reading person here. The history had been, we had once upon a time had content people here, and they kind of moved on and became the content organizations. And NEA didn't really deal with content, but it became clear, especially with the Reading Excellence Act, first of all, that we needed to have content people on staff to deal with the policy issues because they touched content directly. So I came here at the time that the National Reading Panel was meeting down the street, and we sat in on a couple of the sessions, and 2 things happened because of that. One is that I decided the voices of teachers were not being heard in the discussions about what needs to be done to save us, from becoming a nation of illiterates. I was concerned that there were people making these decisions who didn't even have a reading background, and not only that, had not worked with kids. So I had NEA call together a group of incredible teachers to be our advisory group and to develop a statement about what we believe should happen vis-a-vis reading. And this group included the National Teacher of the Year at that time, who was a kindergarten teacher, Andy Baumgartner. It included a Krista McAuliffe Award-winning teacher. It included a couple of state Teachers of the Year, a couple of our state presidents who had reading background. Almost every single person on that group had some kind of recognition for their expertise and leadership in education, but particularly also in reading. That group came out with a booklet. We tried to keep it simple, bullets, but it also, we were able to pull everything together in a one-paragraph statement. And the main points, when people say, what does NEA say about reading? We can give them the policy statement now. And by the way, the policy statement and the booklet were approved 100% by our governing board, which is about 250 people. So not bad. At any rate, that our policy is, first of all, that there is no one way to teach reading that works with every child all of the time. The second part about that is that teachers are the key. This is nothing new. Teachers' expertise is key in the whole process. Teachers matter more than anything else. And last but not least, part of the statement is the teachers can't do it by themselves. They need the policy support and the community support to carry it out. And I may come back to this later, but when I talk about this, when I elaborate on that piece, and when NEA does also, we see that as not encompassing only education policy, but we know that kids come to school with huge gaps, and those gaps are affected by policy that touches on the welfare of children from the time of conception. How do I deal with that?
You're talking about the teachers can't do it by themselves.
Right.
I think there's a really important flow connection here between, on the one hand, teachers are the key, and on the other hand, they can't do it themselves.
Right.
That juxtaposition.
Right, and I think it sounds almost contradictory, but it is just as critical, and NEA works a lot on policy writ large beyond education. And we have a specialist in early childhood, for example, who works a lot on what we do long before children get to school. We're looking at child care providers and whether they should be certified and paid better, because those people impact children at a really critical stage. And again, the achievement gap starts, in some cases, at conception with a lack of good prenatal care. It continues in the early years of the child's life with either a lack of medical care, a lack of nutrition, or a lack of good child care, where children's cognitive and social development is key in those very, very early years.
Relative to that last point, one of the things that we found, we just did an interview with Jack Shonkoff, and last 2 weeks ago, Hard and Risley.
Right.
It's
yes.
powerful correspondence between language exposure.
Absolutely.
And how well that dovetails with neuroscience about what's causing the brain to grow healthily, and how well the pattern of language exposure variation in children before 4 has such a correspondence to their performance in the 3rd and 4th grade.
Right. And vocabulary is one of my special interest. My research and a lot of my work has been in prior knowledge and comprehension, but the other area is vocabulary. And I've taken a look at I should say I was influenced heavily by the research of Isabel Beck, which her original research was elegant and very thorough. And she suggested kids needed something like 5 to 7 exposures to a word to make it their own. And she talks about ownership of vocabulary, not just rattling back a definition. It's essentially conceptual development. So when you think of vocabulary as conceptual development, then of course it makes sense to think that there's neurological effect of vocabulary development because it's about connections in the brain.
Yeah. Keith Stennett called it the primary tool of cognitive development, at least with respect to language and verbal intelligence, is that we can see from talking with neuroscientists specializing in sound processing and phonemic awareness differentiation that the vocabulary is the exercise environment the brain is differentiating the soundscape in to develop PA. At the same time, it's developing the background that the transcription system of reading has to play in order for that to work. So
exactly.
It's just key on every level.
Yes, yes. And I would say, and I don't know whether this is kind of moving out of the sequence, but I'll mention it. There's not a sequence and it doesn't matter, I figure. At any rate, one thing I would say is right now there's a lot of talk about the crisis that children can't read, and frequently NAEP scores are quoted as the source of that. And because I helped design what is the current NAEP, I'm pretty familiar with it, having read kids' responses to the questions and, done item analysis and so forth. Actually, we just finished reviewing the descriptions at the anchor levels of what kids seem to be doing. And from a lot of that, I can tell you the reason children are not reaching proficient on NAEP is, for the most part, not because they can't read a lick. They can read. And we've done a couple of oral reading studies. So we're finding that, it's not so much that these kids are non-readers, but rather that they can't read. There are two problems. One is they're not fluent enough to read the longer passages on NAEP and then get to all the questions. Or two, they're not very thoughtful readers. They don't, they really are not good frequently at nuances. And think, the first thing that comes to them, they kind of scribble down without thinking about it more carefully. And I should add a third thing, because we see it in what they do, and that is that they frequently don't examine the text carefully and go back and really think about whether this is the right answer or not the right. They don't recheck in the text, and we've actually done a little bit. I've worked with a friend on a little bit of research. They don't like to look back, as we say, to make sure that their answer is correct, which is it's not really a code problem. It's a disposition problem. And so, when I talk about reading, I like to think about the code is a critical foundation, but while that's being laid down, you have to have that oral language and conceptual foundation that you need to sometimes build up more with some kids, usually the very kids, in some cases, who are getting so much emphasis on code that they're not getting enough time to build up that conceptual and language development. So that needs to be built too. But the other thing is the kind of engagement, as John Guthrie would talk about it, with the text and with reading tasks, and where kids are sort of disengaged. I'm just going to finish this to get it done with. Then we have problems. And it looks like, when we look at the scores, it looks like they can't read. They're not proficient readers. And somebody in the general community says, oh, not proficient readers, they can't read. Well, that's not always the case. We can tell by the other items that they do that they can read, but they're just not particularly inclined to put forth the extra effort or to be very thorough in their responses. So to me, part of having highly proficient readers is it's not just the code, it's not just the oral language and the vocabulary and knowing how text works and the fluency, but it's also an array of dispositions and ability to think critically.
Yeah, I really like what you said. And let's go in and explode that open for more detail, because I really think it's important. There's a lot of work we've encountered that shows that the capacity for critical self-reflection and for metalinguistic awareness, kind of the first 2 points that you made, is really built during the reading process, in a way. That reading is building the infrastructure that lets us do that. That a lot of anthropological studies of oral language people that have never had their oral language biased by a literate system, touching their oral language system, they don't think the same way we do. They don't have the same degree of critical self-reflection or metalinguistic awareness that we take for granted. So there's something about the way literacy and language combine that's part of what develops those processes for those that take off in it well. Yeah?
Right. Yeah, actually somebody, and I wish I could give you the exact person, said writing is not, people tend to think about writing, for example, as communicating with an external audience, but for many people it's their first tool for communicating with themselves through journals and notes and things like that. There's this movement right now among adults to keep journals. You see it in the magazines like Oprah and things like that. And I think that we've discovered that there is this connection between the literacy skills and being able to, reflect on yourself and come to know yourself better.
Right.
I would add to that, though, there's the literacy tools piece of that, but one of the other things that I'm a proponent of is what I call a complete education, meaning that children have access to the arts, and we have research that suggests that kids who are involved in arts do better on academic subjects such as literacy, and there's definitely links to, opportunities for language development and thinking development that come about when students study the arts. Particularly, we've done some work with visual arts. So I think it's important, as we say, we need to improve the literacy of the children in this country, that we need to think of all the different ways these cognitive links are formed, and all the various array of things that are part of a complete education. Again, because a lot of that background stuff comes into play as children read, but particularly, I think, in arts and some sports, there's this interesting opportunity to come to know yourself.
Yeah, I think just to give you a frame of where we're coming from that might be helpful as we progress. Our main interest is not about the code per se. We're not trying to say let's pound phonics.
Right.
At all.
Right.
Okay. So
yeah.
we're not about an instructional methodology. We're not trying to advocate.
Oh, that was clear. That was clear from looking at
one. The other thing is that it's not so much the acquisition of the utility skill of reading. It's the collateral effects. So what happens over months and years to people that learn to feel bad about themselves, that learn to want to avoid the shame they feel when they get confused. What does that do to them? And it's more the collateral negative effects that we're trying to bring attention to here than the some exclusive sense of literacy centrality to life.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. And having looked at your materials, looked at your webpage and so forth, I could see that, to me, what what I took away was that you were also trying to address the complexity of reading.
Yeah.
Which is why I haven't really hesitated to kind of talk about these various things. And it's interesting because other people that you've interviewed have, they've taken a hold of the elephant in a certain place, and they're particularly focused on that. But it really is, and I think it's exciting that you have this wide array of people that you're including, because it is an elephant, and most of us can only see a part of it.
Yeah, thank you. So with those kind of backgrounds, then the next part of the conversation goes to, okay, clearly we think that from what we've gathered so far, there's 3 different fields that you cannot really talk about this independently of how they're all interplaying. One is the language foundation, the general language foundation, including vocabulary, including the exercise in the speed and complexity of the language richness in an environment that exercises the phonemic awareness distinctions necessary for the transcription system of the code to play when we get to the code. Then there's the code itself and the artificial kinds of confusions involved in processing it. I mean, there's a whole history of the code, how it got to be this, the 14th century king and his scribes, and how English gets to be the way it is, and the kind of from the neuroscience track, the 20 to 30 milliseconds of time that the letters and sound confusions have to work themselves out, or the brain stutters, and all these pieces. But so one we might say is code or technology-related confusion.
Right.
There's technology-related confusion. There's language foundation. The third piece is the affective dimension. To what extent does somebody's interest in what they're doing and their tolerance for handling frustration before they shame out interplay with those first 2? And there's impossible to talk about this without all 3 of those play into play.
I think that's good. Yeah.
Right?
I mean that's a good description.
So then the language foundation is coming out of the home primarily. The instructional pathway through the confusions of the codes coming in through the institutions, the teachers. Right. And the affective dimension is happening at the interface between both of them.
Right. And in I would say the total school context.
Yes, okay. So I'm saying institution and home, how the whole thing creates a sense in the child that they can succeed, or that changes. I mean, you can tell a child all you want, but if they've had 1,000 or 10,000 negative experiences with this confusion, their nervous system is wanting to escape from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we go back to what you were talking about before about the code, the language environment. I mean, this maps over to where you were, I think, pretty well. What the difficulty with the code piece, where that connects up though, is that underneath our cognitive bandwidth for comprehension and for meta-reflective awareness of language and critical self-reflection is that the machinery of the code processing is running ecologically, efficiently. And that if it's not, there's too much being spent there for these other things to work. So in that sense, the code's involved across all the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean.
So you need to have that.
Yeah,
yes.
That's where I'm. Now, having said that, I'm going to come back and say, so, what is your research? How does your research plug into these different spaces as we've just differentiated them since you came forth and I kind of came back there?
Well, I mean, and my own research is limited, so I'm not. I'm certainly
that you have access
or that I have access to. Right. I was going to say because I'm not a Tim Shanahan, but and I would both research and experience because I'm convinced that the code plays a greater or lesser role in different individuals. And I think for some individuals, it may be an overemphasis can really cause problems. So that's why you need a variety of things. But certainly, if a student is spending all of his or her energy trying to figure out the words, there is no cognitive energy left for comprehension. I mean, we know that. And that's why we kind of do that little 5-finger rule with kids. We open a book in the library and just read the page and put your finger down each time you come to a word that you don't know and can't figure out. And if you've got your hand all 5 fingers down on the page, it's probably going to be a very hard book for you to read. So yeah, and that's just, that's a strategy built on what we know about cognitive processing load and that mental energy. In addition to that, though, you can be decoding fine, but not be fluent enough that you can really get through the text quickly and efficiently. You can read very slowly, and I actually, my 2 sons were so different, and one read easily, quickly, basically learned whole word. He read along with the Bill Martin books on tape as well as with me, and kind of memorized the books, and the next thing I knew he was reading. The other one did a little bit of that, but he was never the easy, fluent reader because he really was slow. And he, to this day, reads a lot of technology books and tries to remember everything. He's the kind of person that can pick up a book on Wall Street and just swallow it and tell you a whole lot about Wall Street. And he understands it. But his reading of novels, he finally started being interested in reading novels after college when he started reading Stephen King. And I said to him one day, do you read faster now that you're reading Stephen King and you kind of read for plot? And he said, oh no, because I like to stop and savor the language. So he has a style, and he's fluent to a certain degree. He probably wouldn't be he reads fluently orally. He wouldn't be a speed reader, however, with his silent reading, but for whatever reason, it fits his style. So I think that we have to consider that speed plays in here, fluency plays in some very complex ways. We also have kids who read everything word perfect, and then they look at you and you say, now what was the story about? And they have the deer in the headlights look because they don't have a clue what they've read. And they can read with fluency and accuracy and still not understand it. So something else has gone wrong here. And that's why I think it's so important that we have well-trained teachers, because a teacher who has a set of resources that's been given to her by the school district to work with has to be able to see that child for whom those resources are not working and know what kinds of changes need to be made for that particular child. One of the things about research that I like to think about is I think research is important and it informs us and it's important to have it. But for every study that says this has a significant effect on kids' performance, there's this group of kids for whom it didn't have a significant effect. We don't even know if it made them worse. We have no idea. And we don't have studies that I know of where an intervention was 100% effective. So there we have, this complexity. These are individuals, and it's not just a matter of children who are at risk, who don't have enough oral language or have some cognitive processing problems. It really is very much individual differences. What you talked about motivation, and that's so critical, but what motivates one child does not motivate another. That's one of the things that makes teaching so difficult for teachers, is because you're responding to 20-some children, and of those 20 children, your particular response to maybe a general situation in the classroom may improve the situation vis-a-vis most of the kids, but there's a handful for whom that response, for whatever reason, turned them off, made them angry, whatever it is. So that affective thing is important too.
Yeah. So they've got to be able to read the readers. They've got to be able to read what's going on in the readers.
Exactly. Exactly.
And whereas we can't say what motivates them, we can say pretty generally that that which causes them protracted feelings of shame in relation to what they're doing is demotivating them.
Absolutely.
And that's happening.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, I don't know how much you use personal accounts in this, but my grandson, and I have a lot more years of experience and knowledge now that I'm looking at my grandson who lives with me. And in first grade, his teacher, who was not as knowledgeable as the one he has this year. In first grade, she held up at the parents' night the workbook and said, "We have to get through this year." It was as if that was her goal. So each night he had X number of pages of the workbook to complete. And what I received home at night from his classwork was also notebook pages to complete. And he had a lot of trouble with school. He was not highly motivated last year. I mean, he got through and we worked with him and everything, but he certainly wasn't as easy a scholar as my sons. And this year, he has a teacher who missed her national board certification by 4 points on her science test. So she's incredibly knowledgeable. She's working on a master's in reading. And her whole classroom, you just walk into the classroom and it's a different feel with a reading center. And they write, I spent the first 2 days of school in the classroom. Those children write every day. They started writing the first day of school. There are manipulatives. The children, one of the things she did on the second day of school was introduce them to the math manipulatives, and she was working on the routine that they were supposed to use, when to stop, what her signals were, and so forth. But they were so excited about the manipulatives, and she turned to me and she said, "This is what it's supposed to be about, this excitement." She said, I wish we didn't have to deal with the tests because this is so exciting. And this year, she sent home the workbook and said, "You can practice this if you want. This is what we're doing, this is the book from reading." But the kids, his homework is all about vocabulary and spelling and writing. He writes paragraphs or sentences or uses vocabulary words in sentences or spelling words in sentences or uses 3 words in one sentence or writes a paragraph about it. It's constant writing, and his reading homework every night is to read with us for 20 minutes, which to me is ideal, and he is so much more engaged than he was before. But I could see the signs in first grade of that frustration. The behavior problems came when he couldn't figure out what he was supposed to do with reading, and he didn't feel successful. So, he was lucky to have a reading specialist as a grandma to step in and to kind of give support and intervene. But I think of how many kids don't get that kind of chance. How many kids, after that first workbook teacher, had another workbook teacher, and the teacher didn't know what to do, how to get a child like him on task. This teacher has been magic. I mean, he's like a different child. So I think it's interesting, the power of the teachers in this situation.
This cuts to, for us, the difference between a teacher who's a robotic extension of a script of behavior that they're really not owning, and a teacher who is actively first person engaged in learning how to teach and lift the learning of children in their care.
Right. And it's not, the one teacher, she loves kids, and she tried very hard. She worked very hard with us to work with him. So she was motivated, she wanted to help, but she didn't have the same kind of background.
guess that one of the things that makes the big background and the people that we've experienced, I certainly don't have the experience that you do with the range of teachers, is that it seems that some of the ways that teachers are trained to be teachers train out of them the first person learning, which is the characteristic of the most successful teacher.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because you just punched one of my buttons, as it were, because when we talk about knowledgeable teachers, I don't mean teachers that know how to follow a script, that can recite, the 5 critical areas of reading or something like that. I do mean teachers who are reflective, who think about strategies, who take them and make them their own. Many years ago, when I was at Maryland State Department of Ed, we worked on a special project where we were doing videos to be put on the discs, and ultimately the plan was to have it on the web, of teachers doing specific strategies. And so they came to me and said, "Barb, what would you like to have on this video with respect to reading?" And I thought, well, how can I use the power of video to get across some ideas that it's very difficult to convey in black and white, in print? And I thought, discussion, classroom discussion around reading, and how do you get the kids responding to what they've read and thinking about it. And as a result of that, I went to several different teachers as they looked at getting kids engaged with text, and for the most part it was discussion. And I had a teacher who had taken reciprocal teaching, which is one of the most highly researched strategies for comprehension. And she had combined it with some cues that had been developed in the state for thinking. So there was a little symbol for main idea, and there was a little symbol for cause and effect. And as the kids developed their questions, which is part of reciprocal teachings, they have to do their own questions, they had the symbols there as cues. And in the early stages, she would put the symbol and say, "Can you develop a cause and effect question about this?" And she also changed it because she made it much more discussion. They had to work with a partner to come up with their questions rather than individually. So she adapted that technique. Now, it was a research-based strategy, and if it had been in a highly scripted program, there's a script for how to do it, but she had taken it to a whole other level. And one of the things that I had on videos of each teacher was an interview of where they wanted to go next, to capture the notion that the best teachers are always looking to make it better. They never stand pat. They never say, "Okay, it's fine. It can't get any better than this." I think almost all of the teachers that I've known that I thought were exemplary are always looking for another thing. How can I make them think more deeply? How can this discussion begin to be more authentic so they respond to each other? That's
precisely what we mean by first-person learning.
Yes.
It's not someone, they're not doing something because so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, but because all of that is informing their ongoing first-person learning into extending their teaching practice more effectively.
Absolutely. And as a person here at the Teachers Organization, one of the things that we believe is important as an approach to that is not these situations, where you bring 300 teachers together and have a speaker talk to them, but rather ongoing teacher-directed professional development that is inquiry-centered, where teachers look at the data or evidence of children's growth and learning from their classrooms. I'm not talking large-scale data. I'm talking the kinds of things kids might be writing, and they look through these and say, what are the kids doing well that we can reinforce? What would we like to do next? Putting their heads together, coming up with strategies, trying them out in the classroom, looking again at the children's work to see, and sharing stories from the classroom to see how these things are working. So that kind of teacher-led inquiry is, I think, essential for developing the kinds of teachers who can make decisions and solve problems that we need in order to have good readers.
Excellent, excellent. How are we doing on time? 4 months, stop, sit down, and shuffle through the piles.
I do.
That's
I
how you
do.
deal with it.
And one of the wonderful things
That leaves
is
out all the things that aren't that important.
anymore. Right,
Yeah, just-
exactly. I don't have to read this now. Exactly.
Yeah, I know the mechanism.
Let me get a swig of water too.
Let's do this. Let's take a few minutes and go factoid for a little while, and then go back to discussion mode in a while. Okay. So
Okay.
it's kind of bouncing.
Although you have to know that you're dealing with somebody who suffers from mental pause, so sometimes can't remember exactly the facts.
Okay. All right. Whatever's.
But we'll go
Whatever's
for it, and
comfortable.
we'll see
Yeah.
where we go.
I particularly want to go to the NAEP scores, to the distinction between basic and proficiency, which we touched on before.
Right. Yes.
And as you've seen from the interviews that we have conducted, what Ryan and Whitehurst and Wendorf have said about this, they're speaking, and so is Wedgeworth at pro literacy
Right.
at the adult level, or Sharon Darling at the National Center for Family Literacy, or Tim Shanahan, or these different dimensions. They are saying, look, we got a big problem here. Now, without taking on the issue, well, how much of it is the code and how much of it is the language and how much of it is affect, we just say, in order to succeed in our world, this thing called writing and reading has to become transparent to our ability to learn and travel in the world today, to some degree. It's that
Absolutely.
important. And that if we are not to that level of being proficient, where reading is as transparent as listening, which I want to come back to that point relative to what you said about kids that can read but don't understand. How big a problem? Do we have a problem? Is there a crisis? Is there a problem on a national dimension with respect to reading?
The response is not yes or no. I think it's a response that's complex. We do have a crisis, but I would define the crisis as an achievement gap crisis, mainly. Not that literacy in this country is abysmal. And I would do that because on international assessments, we don't look so bad. When you look at countries between which there are significant differences, so it's one thing to rank a certain place, but maybe the first 5 countries on PEARLS, the international assessment for 4th graders, the first 5 countries may not be significantly different from each other, but their overall averages put them in that order, which is important to know. But the other thing is that our highest readers are as high as the highest readers anywhere. They're very good readers. The problem is that we have this huge gap, and we have these kids that aren't reading. So another country actually may not have their highest readers reading as high as our readers, but they don't have the gaps, and everybody is doing better. So we have this gap problem. We know we have it. We definitely see it in the TIMS and the PISA data for our older children, 15-year-olds. So in the I think it's the PISA data, which is the 15-year-old assessment, we have one of the largest achievement gaps of any of the countries who participate in that international assessment. Our top kids are doing as well as the top kids in the other countries. So what's dragging us down in terms of overall literacy is not that we don't have good literacy programs anywhere in this country. It's that we have a whole group of students who don't have access to whatever it is they need to be good readers. So that's part of my response to you, talking about literacy in general in the United States as it compares to literacy in the world. But there's another piece too, and that's looking at NAEP itself, because that's our own standard that we've set. We set the standard on the current NAEP very high. There is no test in this country like NAEP reading. They have imitated it to a certain extent, but I really think I've looked at a lot of the commercial tests that have used the same taxonomy as NAEP and tried to add more open-ended items and everything. But really, when you look at the passages, the rigor of the passages and the questions, I still think NAEP is one of the most rigorous assessments in the entire country. So it's a very high standard, and it was done on purpose. We knew that it was going to be a goal set far out. It is a test that is not necessarily directly linked to specific curriculum, but rather overall curriculum, which has its good points and bad points. In literacy, it's not as much of a problem because frequently in literacy, you're still finding the main idea, whether you're a first grader finding the main idea of a little teeny story, or whether you're a law student trying to match the main idea of a court case to the main idea of a particular legal situation. Those are essentially main idea kinds of activities, so you've got different levels. So the taxonomy is not, in literacy, I don't think, it's the level that really is important. When we say kids are below basic on the NAEP, that still doesn't mean they can't read. If you look at, there's a little chart in one of the reports that has the anchor information, not the achievement levels, but the anchors. And you have where the cut score is for the achievement level. So if you look at the chart, there's a score for below basic. And then they've marked some points below that score and said kids who score here can do X. Most of them can do this. The majority of them can do this. That comes from actually doing a statistical analysis and then looking at the items that kids who scored there or higher were able to do. So when you look at that, it says that we have kids who are below basic in that 40% who can find the main idea of a simple short story, who can relate certain facts to details, can find the theme in a simple story. So those kinds of things, that means these are not non-readers. It means that we've set a high standard. And yes, it's a problem. We should have all of those kids reading at the proficient level. But am I moving too much?
Yeah, we picked up some mic noise, so I'm going to readjust the microphone real quick.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Not your fault.
I know I started waving my hands.
No, that's quite all right.
Here. Let's see.
Yeah, I should give it a little more distance. How's that?
Great. Oh, you're asking her. I'm sorry.
Yeah, about 10 minutes on this.
Okay. All right. Rolling in.
So I guess trying to pull this all together and summarize it, I would say that yes, we have a problem, but it's not simply that all of our kids are poor readers. It's that, again, we don't have enough access to good reading teachers and programs and the kinds of things that feed into that, like good child care and oral language development and support for parents and parent education, to bring up the bottom group of kids. I'm amazed. If you talk to some of the the young children, the second graders and third graders in some of these exemplary schools, you would be amazed at their level of literacy, at what they're reading and how they talk and think and write about it. And those kids would definitely be proficient on NAEP. But the problem is I see the problem as the gap. Not that literacy is miserable in this country, but that we have a huge gap. I also think that part of the problem is a motivation problem to complete the tasks on NAEP. And fourth graders will usually go along with the program. Eighth graders are less likely, and we haven't figured out yet how to get 12th graders to really engage with the tasks on NAEP so that we really know that this represents truly what they can and can't do.
Okay. Well, I think your what I'm hearing is perfectly consistent with others. I mean, I don't think anybody said that the country as a whole that everybody in the country has a literacy problem, but that the dimensions of our population whose lives are diminished because they didn't become sufficiently proficient with reading so that they could gateway and enable them in life is a big dimension of our population. And that if maybe you can help connect this, if rather than saying basic and proficient, these are artificial distinctions that we've established. We just said, like, if people don't have the internal skills and attitudinally and cognitively to push themselves through the point where reading, the written word, so to speak, becomes transparent to what they want to learn and what they want to do, they're suffering.
Yes.
Yeah? And that in that sense, how much of our population is in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say persistence is a reading skill.
It's a skill necessary to success.
It's a disposition. It's a disposition. I mean, without it, it's very hard to be a highly proficient reader. And think of as you get older as a reader, and you have to persist in seeking that meaning in the text to clarify what's not immediately clear from your reading. And that's. This is going to sound very strange, but it's ingrained very much in our total values of our culture right now. Okay. It's hard to teach a student to put forth extra effort when their parents drive around the parking lot for 5 minutes trying to save 6 steps to the supermarket entrance. I think that, our parents need to know more about how they model for their children and how they instill not only the knowledge and the cognitive skills, but the dispositions that are important in schooling. And it's grueling work as a parent to do that. Actually, almost a sidebar, but there's a lot of talk right now in high school reform, because I'm very involved in high school reform, about Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 as being essential courses for high school graduation. Well, actually, I think if we wanted to impact the success of education in this country, we would have a required course on human development at the high school level that would teach our high schoolers something about language and cognitive and social development in children, because to be honest, person for person, they're more likely to be using that child development course in their later life than algebra. So I just, to me, it's a no-brainer. When people talk about, I think in South Dakota or North Dakota, they have a requirement for a gun safety course. And in those states, that makes sense. But I just think that through the whole country, very seldom do people go through their lives not having to deal with young people in some way or fashion. And to have that kind of basic background is really critical. So we're talking about parent education programs, and I think those are critical, sharing with parents. I used to do PTA presentations a lot on this kind of stuff for them. And they're fascinated with it. But we need to be developing a generation of parents who will support a generation of proficient readers.
Excellent. I couldn't agree more. We interviewed Sue Stapleton at Parents as Teachers
Yes.
National Association, and we are working with as many people to show just how critical the family environment is to everything. Going from the Coleman report on the economic side with Heckman and other economists to sociologists like Farkas and his work,
Right.
to organizations that are family-centric like NCFL or
Right.
Teachers. To bring all these together to say, what is the kind of boundary, the gravitational fields of influence between what kind of dispositions and orientations are forged and are growing in the family, and what is the real institutional reach? Not that we can't remediate anything, or that we're not plastic and can't remediate anything, but where's the real neurologically, pedagogically optimal environments for different kind of milestones in development? How do we get to them?
Well, I think the other thing is we have to, again, think that it's not simple. It's not simple like just the child responding to the text. There's all the baggage and things the child brings. I think of it visually almost, of two intersecting circles. And there's the child at the intersection. And one circle is schooling and another circle is home. But those two circles are in a larger circle that is community and culture and all of these. There are the economics of the family, but that's within the larger circle of the economics of the country, and values and so forth. So it is, I think that the answers get more and more complex. And yes, we can start with cognition. We can start with things to do for young children, and we can start by looking at instruction. And I would never want to suggest that instruction isn't key. But I think if we were serious in this country about high literacy, we would at the same time begin to try to address some of these other factors. And at least, the reflective teacher thinks about how his or her values and own dispositions and ways of dealing with kids are having an impact on the achievement of those students. It would be lovely if parents and the wider community would begin to think about how things that are part of the broader community also impact on children. What values are being demonstrated, and how do they affect students' dispositions, as well as their cognition and their knowledge. And do families value, even middle-class families, value taking kids out for experiences versus letting them have their Game Boy? One of the things I've discovered is that my grandson is totally taken up with books on tape right now. We have discovered the Redwall series, and every time he gets in the car he wants me to turn on the tape so he can listen to that series. And it's a very challenging set of books to listen to because all the characters have British Isle accents and vocabulary that's British, but he doesn't do the Game Boy, and he has it. We took a long trip recently and the Game Boy was in the car, but he was totally enthralled with the book on tape, where he's getting language, the structure of written language, background knowledge. We were talking about all the different animals that we're not familiar with, like a stoat and a hedgehog and so forth. So I think we need to reconsider values. Are you out of tape? I think it's clear I'm not dispassionate. Actually, I'm pretty well behaved today.
Gathering people's passions. I mean, that's what our hope is.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
is that our passion and our learning can come together in stewarding the health of our children's learning.
I love it. And see, I see it all as we need to be committed in this country to the well-being of children writ large. And you look at France. It's an interesting country because they have all kinds of state support for parents and working parents. Their schools are interesting. I mean, you just take your child to the door and that's it. You have to trust the teachers. There's not parental involvement in the schools. They seem to be doing fine, but I've talked to a person who was, her kids were not native speakers of French, and she said it was traumatic to take them to the door of the school and leave, but it went fine. It went fine. So, but there is a national commitment to the well-being of children. There are stipends for parents with kids, but you have to bring your kid to the annual physical to get the stipend. So, and there are other countries in Europe that have similar kinds of structures for looking after the well-being of children. Italy, parts of Scandinavia, and we're cutting our money. We're not. I get passionate about that because it's we can't say that we want highly proficient readers and then cut money for families and children.
Yeah, one of the things I do whenever I talk is I talk with the audience and just ask, what is it about a child's future happiness, well-being, academic success, cognitive, emotional development that isn't connected to how well they're learning?
Yeah, nothing.
Therefore, underneath everything else, as our kind of central organizing principle, how is it that we orient ourselves so as to be stewarding the health of their learning, how well they're learning generally, and how they're participating in their emotional experiences is equally critical to how well they're experiencing their academic challenges, or their, and that any concern for the well-being of children seems to me to end up in taking care of the health of how well they're participating from the inside out in their own learning.
Right. I would agree. And I'm thinking, and there's one aspect, there's so much that you learn that's critical too, and I think it reflects, to me, that there's another aspect that I haven't even talked about in literacy, and that is, I have a favorite quote, which is not up on my wall, but is essentially that we don't read and write so that we have a better workforce. We read and write to connect to each other and ourselves. And we read and write to promote the habit of truth-telling in our midst. And no habit is more important to the survival of democracy than that habit and the feeling and the sense of common feeling and common longing. And I didn't put it as eloquent.
Sounds like Thomas Jefferson.
It was Benjamin DeMont, who was an educator, and I use it constantly. I'd have to dig it out for you, but did I let it slide again? Okay. But to me, if we don't have literate people who can think critically and be honest with themselves and with others, we cannot sustain democracy. So, I mean, it's not only about the welfare of our children, it's about our welfare too. It's whether this democracy will continue to exist.
Yeah, it is one of the things that we find is that there are people that seem to be totally disconnected from a care for the human being, right? And that are concerned with the economy, with
right.
the nation as a whole, as this big abstract process, as if it's not comprised of these young individual people growing into
right.
it. And yet the beautiful thing is that there is a kind of miraculous intersection, because even if you care only for the bots that feed the economic machinery, whether you care about just the bots that feed the economic machinery, or you care about stewarding the emergence of the spirit of human beingness, right? Whichever thing, you still come to the same place.
Right. Right.
Which is there's no getting around the general health of learning, and in particular literacy as an interface to being able to grow into the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I personally, I won't say this on the tape, but I personally think we have a crisis of leadership in this country. We don't have leaders of real stature. And I think that some of our most impressive leaders have been highly literate people. I mean, they come to that through a certain amount of literacy. And
that's why they revere it. I mean, we spent yesterday morning with my homeschooled daughter walking around Monticello.
Yeah.
Yesterday. So I mean, we're on the trek of identifying the
Jefferson. Well, Monticello is certainly a place to say, oh my God, how did a nation, how was this man ever produced? And and there were so many like him at that time. Why don't we have that kind of person now? People of passion, integrity, knowledge, and wisdom.
Which is, well, yeah.
I mean, we have politicians. We don't have statespeople. I mean, they're not willing to do the right thing. and that's the Alaskan pipeline thing just made me crazed.
Yeah, the conflict of interests abounds. So, let's talk about. Let me ask a question that comes in a somewhat different angle, which is very simply. Are you ready?
Oh.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, yeah. Well, is the tape on?
Just
no.
turn it back on. Yeah.
Oh my God! While I was putting my lipstick on.
No.
Okay. Okay, because I thought it was off, so I'm sitting here just sort of pulling myself together.
Oh, no.
Okay,
besides,
go for it.
Yeah.
And you can cut and paste. I mean, I know that it's going to be probably 20 seconds. If you do anything with any of it, it'll be 20 seconds. So, yeah.
Probably longer than that. What we will do is we'll transcribe this at some point, like you've seen here. We'll send you the raw.
Right.
So you go, wait a minute, I just doesn't.
Yeah, right. Good. Okay, great.
Right?
Okay, good.
Let me ask this question, which is kind of connects a lot of different dots, which is, what is reading?
Reading, in its fullest sense, is translating symbols into ideas and grasping a communication, responding to that communication, thinking about that communication, connecting that communication to other communications, other information, and so forth. So that I would say that there's a component of communication, there's a component of knowledge, linkage, and there's a component of thinking, sort of rearranging that knowledge. So as I read, for example, I might think, no, I don't agree with that. Or this is like something else. But you can read in so many different ways. I mean, sometimes reading is just getting lost in a book and just going to another place. Sometimes reading is a search for some specific information or directions. It's the purposes of reading are wide, and so it's hard to say exactly. I mean, there's a thinking component, there's a decoding or symbol translation component, there is a message getting component. It's funny because what threw me when you asked that is I don't tend to talk about reading. I talk about literacy, which is a little bigger thing, and definitions that are broad definitions of literacy, which would be, being able to understand the messages that come to you from a variety of media, print being the most critical, and being able to communicate in a variety of media, writing being central to when we think literacy, the derivation of the word, so that I tend to consider it a broader thing. So if you're saying words and you're not understanding them and you can't think about them, then you're not reading.
Good. I could stretch that out. We also have, we're kind of working on multiple definitions. She just popped in. I'm going to pause this. Come on.
Come in.
Good.
I heard you talking.
Good. That was good. Now you get the cozy chair again.
All right, thank you.
All is well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that just paused it or not. I don't know if it did. I'll come at this from asking a question that connects with something you said earlier about kids that seem to be able to read at very fluently, but don't understand. One of the things I've been interested in asking anybody who makes that point, because it's out there a lot. Nancy Bell's really big on this. Is how could we know what part is uniquely reading and what part is comprehension in general, unless we establish some kind of a listening comprehension baseline, so that we could tell that their difficulty in getting the gestalt or the all at once or tracking the big picture meaning is unique to the media of reading as distinct to general to language.
Well, we used to, when I my very much younger days, when I was in the graduate program in reading, one of the things that we did was we had a clinic at the Reading Center, and we did diagnostic testing and workups. And one of the things that we did was a listening comprehension assessment. So we would do the usual kind of leveled, we'd figure out how to put where to put a student by reading single words, and then we'd put them in a text that we thought was about right to see how they would read it aloud and how they would respond to the comprehension questions. And when they dropped out and couldn't do it, when they reached their frustration level, we would then read them a passage and ask them questions, so that we did have a listening comprehension score that was kind of related to grade level. I mean, it had a grade level relationship.
Granular enough and detailed enough to correlate to their
right,
comprehension.
exactly.
So it's a baseline for it.
Exactly. And that was important because we use that to help establish their potential. So a child might be
reading comprehension if we don't have that.
Well, I think it's really critical. what would be interesting is to see, to do, and I'm sure there probably is some research in this, to look and see if there are kids who simply don't understand connected discourse, period. It's not just written discourse, it's any, listening to it. They still don't get it, and they don't get it. Right, 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 exactly.
And right now, on a broad scale, we talk about reading comprehension problems around the country, but we don't have a broad around the country reference for comprehension in oral language. So I don't know how we could pin it to reading.
Exactly. And it is complex. And actually, Sheila Valencia has a very nice article, and I'm not sure where it is, but she's done research looking at kids who fell below the bar and then going in and doing further testing that demonstrates how different these students are. They are all below the bar, but for very different reasons.
Yeah, I would admit that's the other thing that's very interesting to me is that though we talk about there's some kids that have a problem with getting it all, even though they're reading at a good speed, or there's other kids that we talk about these variations, but if we were to look at where's the distribution of the biggest problem, it seems to me from all we're gathering is that it's the slow start, stop hesitations that go along with core processing, that they're never escaping from that, even though, yes, there are people that have this problem, this time. If you look at the percentage or distribution of the population that has these problems, that fundamentally they're not getting out of the hole.
I think you're probably right. I think you have to think, though, when you say problems, what are you defining as reading problems? Are you talking about kids in a classroom or whatever who have these characteristics in reading, who have problems? Or are we talking about the 40% who are not proficient on NAEP? Because the kids who are not proficient on NAEP, that I'm not sure we would say that that's the main reason that they're not proficient. But so I think we have to think about what the problems are to sort of get to a really basic level as a reader to function in the classroom on grade level. Okay, that functioning in the classroom on grade level, certainly in elementary school, is about that. Being a proficient reader on something like NAEP and some of the state tests is about more than that. So it's hard. I'm not sure I would chalk it all up to that.
Yeah, I mean to do that.
I think it's
no evidence that I've been able to find. I mean, when we say that that they're reading fine and now they're on to other levels of problems. I mean, I don't make the distinction, and I don't know I don't see the sense in making the distinction that the comprehension problem or the fluency problem or the code processing problem. I mean, I've talked to every neuroscience working in this space, and they don't know anything really about the speed of interactions at the, when we're talking about the speed at which 20 milliseconds or so, the brain's shuttling information to assemble this process in our minds. We don't have any equipment that's got into that space yet.
Right.
There's a big black mysterious hole in the center of reading science, and so we can't tease out and say, well, the code's being processed fine, but now we're having this problem.
Right.
There's no neuroscience basis for that.
Yeah.
They're all lumped and fused together in an as yet to be differentiated space where it seems pretty clear that an inefficient code processing infrastructure is going to manifest itself throughout the entire spectrum of subsequent developments.
Right. Absolutely. But there's more.
Okay, good.
I would say that there's more too, though. And I'm thinking about some of our prior knowledge and comprehension research. And actually, one of the things that's happened in the past few years is there's been an emphasis pretty much only on intervention research, what works. we had a time in the 70s and 80s where there was a lot of research on the reading process. What are readers doing, or what do they seem to do, or what interferes with it and what helps with it? And it's different than the brain research, which is important, but there are things that the brain research maybe can't pick up that are manifest in different ways. So that it's not every kid, but frequently enough we have interesting things happen, such as a student who will read just enough of the text to kind of get the gist of it and not really read the rest, or not really read it carefully. And that kind of stuff doesn't always show up.
The minimalist disposition. I just want
Yeah,
to
exactly. So, and I don't want to be harping on dispositions all the time, because I know that now that I'm sort of reflecting on what I'm saying, but they do.
That's a reflection of wanting to avoid the confusion.
Exactly.
So irreducible.
Yeah. I mean, it's there. I mean, I think the cognitive structures are very important, but I think we also have these other pieces that we need to be thinking about.
Right, absolutely. My sense is that there's a point at which the cognitive structures are forming in the attitudinal, affective, dispositional fields. And the dispositional, affective fields are developing in relationship to the ecology and efficiency of cognitive processes. And
I know. We need to bring them all along, along with the intervention research. And I hope that we come back to doing some process research that is not brain research, but sort of begins to look at how individuals, and that's the other thing too, is there's something to be said for research that does look at individuals, even though you can't, you can't really generalize it. It points out really interesting differences.
The edges of how much you can trust generalizations.
Right. Well, and a book that really impressed me, just because it was so different, such a different approach as a trained reading person. I had been taking Feldenkrais coaching lessons, and so if you know about Feldenkrais, he's looked at movement and learning and cognition, and the book is called Nora, and it's about an Italian woman, upper middle class, who had, I believe it was a stroke, and she lost the ability to read and write. And he retaught her, but he retaught her in a way that you would never think of, given our thinking now. But he, with his own logic, came up with having her, for example, make a connection between the spoken word and the word in the text, and making that mouth text connection. And when he moved to writing, she had lots of difficulty. He had her hold a pencil, touching her mouth while she read each word, and then move from that on to writing. Not anything that we would probably come up with today, but it just amazes me how different interventions that we might poo-poo sometimes work with people, and interventions that should work don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing, and this comes to, I'll share with you real briefly, our kind of working definition of reading.
Yes.
Is that it is a code-instructed and informed virtual reality language experience.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
In that, and once we're having the virtual language experience, then comes on the subsequent, can I think about it? How aware am I? Can I analyze it just like I could, being meta-conscious of our conversation? But the certain ground level of the virtual reality projector has to work in order for those subsequent things to happen. And that at that level, it is code-instructed and informed relative to our writing technology.
Right.
Our writing technology is a incredibly neglected technology.
And I would add, I'd add to your definition that it's influenced by context and purpose, which gets you back to those kids who are so many times shamed that the context is affecting their ability to do these tasks.
Yeah.
So it's definitely the definition. The old Michigan definition used to be, reading is a process by which the reader constructs meaning from text using their background knowledge and guided by the context and the purposes for reading, or something to that effect. And that whole idea that it is that language experience, but it definitely is influenced, affected by the context, which I guess you could include the purposes in the context.
Yeah.
The context is big.
I think you could say that about our conversation now.
Yeah.
There's purpose, there's context. What is it that's unique and
Right.
exclusive to reading
Right,
as a phenomena in human experience?
right.
Right? That's where I'm trying to break
Yeah.
into that and say, now how does that relate to these other
To
domains?
other
Which clearly
domains.
it does.
Yeah.
But there's something that we're talking about relating to a contrived human-invented technology.
Yeah.
That we've been incredibly nobody's ever gotten together and said, let's all get together and figure out how to make a code that represents our language that's neurologically ecological. Or that's,
Well, what was that? What was the that spelling system that somebody had for a while? It never went anywhere.
You mean the simplified spelling board stuff? In 1906?
Yeah, no. This was around the 70s, 80s.
The ITAs?
Yeah, thank you. She's saying
She
ITA.
said ITA.
Thank you. I couldn't remember it. Yeah, kind of an, but
But then there's a transition problem.
I
It doesn't
know.
work.
How are we going to do this? Yeah, I mean, we
There's
have.
a difference between throwing it all out because it's folly to think about, and that's what's happened.
Yeah,
Right, and understanding that to a significant degree, the challenge that children are experiencing is a challenge engendered by an artificially confusing relationship with a technology.
yeah. So what would you think should be done?
Well, the first thing, and this is what I like about our conversation, and the part that I like most about Reed and Louisa Moats and others is, I think we have to stop throwing the ball before we catch it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We got to be so, like you were saying earlier. We got to be slow down a little bit, trying to say, what is it we're going to do? Let's go do this now. Let's go do this now, and say, how do we get a better kind of grounded, comprehensive picture of what this challenge is to our organism?
Right.
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 And this is a unique challenge, unprecedented in the evolutionary history, neurobiological history of this organism. And until we reframe it and think about it in that way, I don't know that we can come up with the next stage instructional methodologies that could be much more effective if we did. Likewise, as we've been talking about today, the shame and affective dimensions are co-critical to the cognitive.
Absolutely.
When children trigger into shame, it burns up the cognitive processes necessary to stay trained in doing the reading. So it isn't that, wouldn't it be nice to not feel shame? It's fundamentally critical to contextualize this experience in such a way that children aren't going to go to shame if we want them to learn to read.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of things. And then as far as the code goes, I think that for the most part, and this is good from Vinesky, Lyon, and others that we've talked to that are orthographists or coming at it from this point of view, is there's a adultopomorphic, analytical, adults, pattern analyzed view of this code that we're using as our models to teach from, which is radically different than understanding the step-by-step experience that children who are suffering with confusion are actually experiencing.
Right.
And that those of us that can read well no longer experience the confusion in our viscerally in our body. Like Feldenkrais, he's about somatic proprioceptive feedback.
Right.
We no longer have the kind of experience that is relatable
Exactly.
to the experience of somebody who's struggling and suffering. We got to find a way to make the code no longer transparent to us that are good readers. We need to make it opaque to us in a way that brings about in us a sense of confusion and frustration, just like they're experiencing, so that we can meet them in that if we're going to help them.
Right.
So that's
No, I
kind of
agree.
where
So we
we're
need to
coming from.
understand, yes. Well, I think we need to understand both. We need to understand what's happening with those students who are having difficulties and understand it in all its complexity. I think we also need to understand I think we need to continue to look at what good readers do. And that line of research, I think, was very helpful for a while. There was some of that. And that's where we really discovered, for example, the importance of self-monitoring. We realized good readers, when it doesn't make sense, try to fix it up, for the most part.
Right.
And so we need both. I mean, if we just keep looking, actually medical analogies might be in order, because you don't just look at people who have cancer and say, these are the causes and these are how you fix it. You also look at the people who don't get it and say, what are their characteristics that the people who have it don't have, so that we know how to prevent it in the first place.
I think that particularly in terms of like Stanovich's view and others about Goodman and Smith, who we've tried to talk to because we want to get every perspective.
Right.
Is that an analysis of what works good in a good functioning reader is a healthy reference point, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about the developmental neurological infrastructure evolution that leads to it that these other people are stuck in. So it's part of the spectrum of understanding.
It is part of it. It's
but
not
the idea
enough.
That we can unwind from a good reader to understand how to teach to it. That's a big question.
Well, but again, I think on the metacognitive issues, when we realized that these kinds of things were happening, then we were able to begin to teach to some of those things. When we saw the kids weren't paying attention, and we see that all the time in clinics, that kids, if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't stop them. And, they may make sense of a certain amount and then it comes, but they just kind of keep on going.
They've normalized confusion.
Right. But, I think that, it is too bad that certainly it's too bad that Goodman won't, because he started at this very analytical. He's the father of oral reading analysis. And
it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
At one level. And I think human beings are we are meaning-seeking, meaning-oriented, meaning-creating beings. So that only works to the extent that this lower technological process we've been describing generates the kind of virtual language experience that all of us that can work on. So these are both true.
Absolutely. It's just, to me, I think one of my concerns right now is to be sure that the wide range of research is continued, disseminated, and noticed. Because it is this whole spectrum, and it's not about just this piece or that piece.
You can probably recognize, if you've read a couple of our interviews, the tightrope that we walk to avoid advocating or throwing out any of these dimensions.
Right.
Because it's oversimplistic.
Absolutely.
Say this one's right and that one's not, or this one's right and that one's not. And that what is clear is that children with different levels of developmental readiness as they enter this challenge may need any number of different approaches, going right back to your first point. And that for some kids that are ready to take off, drilling them excruciatingly through certain kind of code mechanics could turn them off to the whole process, not help them.
I will never forget a study that I read way back when I was in the doctoral program, and they had randomly assigned students to treatment and control or different situations, and One was a highly code-oriented situation, and the other was kind of a more holistic situation. One little boy who was reading already was put in the code situation and literally regressed by the end of the year. So it's that kind of individual thing. Now, most of the kids made progress, but it's
is this not generally outside to a model, to an analytical model,
yeah,
but actually to an individual child? Is this lessening or increasing the confusion in how they feel about
right.
it and their road through this?
Right.
And if we're not meeting them there, I mean,
and then it's back to these very capable teachers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a pretty good place to rest. I'm happy. I really got all that I came.
Did you? Oh,
really
thank you.
Good. Is there something that we didn't talk about that you think is particularly important that we should touch on as we close? And Cori, having listened in the background, is there anything that you think that we talked about that we wanted to make sure we got that we haven't? Okay.
I don't know. I don't know if you wanted any. I mean, while Cori was out, we talked a little bit about the role of literacy in democracy. I don't know if you want that or not. I mean, that maybe.
We talked about that before she left, I think.
Oh, did we? No, it was while she was out of the room.
Oh, that's right. We talked to you, right?
Now, I don't know if that's pertinent to where you are, so we don't have to put it on there. But I mean, that's part of my passion.
Good.
Anyway.
Let's do that.
Okay. So you want a question, or do you want me to just kind of talk about it?
I talked with Tim Shanahan, who was called into Florida to look at ballots that had all kinds of errors on them, and he found that there were more ballots thrown out to what he attributed to be literacy-related issues than hanging chads and mechanisms, and that when he generalized that to the country, there was no question that of all the things we pay attention to in the electoral process, the illiteracy thing was a much bigger factor in our elections of recent times. So from that to Thomas Jefferson, go where you will.
Well, I mean, and I do think that we need to bear in mind that, yes, the welfare of every single child is absolutely critical. But part of that child's welfare is their future. What kind of a country are they going to be living in as they become adults? And to me, literacy is absolutely essential for democracy. And the kind of literacy that you need for democracy is a thoughtful literacy, not just being able to get the message, but being able to think about it critically, to consider its sources, to connect it to other things, to see if this message in writing makes sense vis-a-vis this other message in writing. And one of my favorite quotes, which I can't give you a word for word, comes from Benjamin DeMont, who an educator, who reminds us that we don't read and write to make sure that we have an educated workforce in this country. We read and write to connect to each other, to know each other's feelings and our own feelings. And we read and write to protect the habit of truth-telling in our midst. And those habits are absolutely essential to democracy. So literacy is not only about taking care of our children. Literacy is about the survival of this country.
Oh, that's a gem. Well done. That was great. Good.
I do have a question.
Yes.
I don't mean to kick us back repetitively here, but when we consider those who aren't reading proficient, this 40%,
Right.
who aren't reading proficient, who aren't kind of being self-reflexive and able to think
Right.
and go into thought dimensions like you just related to democracy, though that is still quite, I feel that's still quite a danger zone.
Oh, it is a danger zone. It's
a
certainly
really critical danger zone
Yes.
that we've got to wake up to as a country, because as you're saying, in creating the future, it was Shanahan who told us that 60% of children who should be receiving free health care because of their ranks in poverty aren't receiving it.
Right.
But why? I mean, obviously, it's not these kids' responsibility to say,
right.
I need health care.
Yes.
It's their parents not being able to access information that's available, or in how we're constructing
Or funds
our
not being
meeting.
Yes.
To not meeting them. The funds are. I mean, it's there for them to get this for free, but either we're not structuring our systems
right.
to meet these parents on the edge, or the parents don't have the ability to think deeper, to
yes.
think deeper, to understand that this is something that's there for them.
That's a good point, Cori. And actually, I have to say, you kind of, again, struck a chord, because I would not want to say that 40% of our kids not being proficient is not a crisis for democracy. Because that's the kind of... Oh, okay. I'm sorry. But it's... Let me just be thoughtful in my...
Is it 40%? I mean, my understanding of NAEP is that it's inverted. There's about 40% that is proficient and about 60+% that's not.
If you wanted to stop, I could tell you the numbers. But I think what I can't remember, what I wish I could look at, is whether it's below basic or below proficient. I think it's 40%. I think below basic is 40%. That's it. This is my senior moment. 40% below basic. So, but again, basic on NAEP. So it is a crisis. It's a crisis because if kids can't demonstrate the kind of literacy that's required to be basic on NAEP, democracy will not survive in this country. And many of those kids will not have access to what education can offer them, and to the kind of economic welfare that they can gain if their literacy skills are that minimal. So at the same time, I just want to keep saying, it's a high level of literacy that we're demanding. So our below basic is not Abraham Lincoln's below basic.
Right, but our world's a lot more complicated.
That's exactly right. That's why we have set it there.
Right.
But what happens is, I just think that frequently when politicians talk about this, the general public is sitting there and saying, below basic, we have 40% of our kids can't read a lick. And that's what concerns me.
Yeah.
They can read, they just cannot read well enough. And it is, you're right, it is a crisis. And it's not only a crisis for the kids in their personal lives, which you've eloquently talked about, but it is a crisis for the survival of democracy, too. And I think, looking at our culture, which is led around by commercial interest without being critical and thoughtful, we can see that we're not producing very highly literate critical thinkers through our education system right now. And, for their own health and welfare in decisions. I mean, we're talking about small things, but other things. You're talking about other things in terms of, how if you are not literate, or if you lack proficiency in reading, that, it's hard to be self-actualized, it's hard to have a decent job, so much is difficult. But in addition to that, on just a very basic level, if you're not literate, how do you know, for example, that this thing is cancer causing or can be harmful to you? How do you decide, the healthy recourse? How do you decide where to invest money to buy a house? Where you're going to work? There's so much. How do you decide which insurance? I mean, even if I am a clerk in a store, I need to decide what insurance to buy. And that's thoughtful, critical reading.
We talked to Bob Wedgeworth for literacy. and they've been doing studies on consumers' behavior with low literacy. And they don't buy the fruits and vegetables if they're bagged in a certain way because the math and the reading association is too complicated. They'll buy them only
If they're not
bagged. Excuse me, they'll buy them if they're bagged. This whole thing costs this much. They can get that. The idea of having to calculate things and that they're living their lives trying to avoid revealing what will embarrass them.
Right. Plus, and they're paying more in so many ways.
Yeah.
You know.
But here's where the NAEP thing seems to be helpful. When you project NAEP out into the adult population, and then you look at the adult literacy survey, which is a new one's coming out, as you know, and all evidence so far is that the numbers are getting worse. The American Medical Association and their work on health literacy and the cost to the nation in terms of unnecessary hospitalizations, consumption of the wrong stuff at the wrong time, not following. I mean, it doesn't take a great stretch to get to the point where we're talking about between $500 billion and $1 trillion a year in related expenses,
Oh, sure.
education and otherwise connected to this phenomenon called human beings coming into literacy. Bigger
Absolutely.
than all the wars combined.
Right. Oh, I agree. I mean, that's why I've stayed in literacy and I'm pretty passionate about it, and stayed very passionate about policy work in literacy too, which is a large part of my work here at NEA is policy work, because I want to make sure that policy really promotes this kind of deep critical literacy and doesn't get sidetracked on sort of putting a Band-Aid.
Superficial utility of.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You know, one other thing that before we wrap that would be helpful is that a lot of people we've talked to, we've kind of gone through this. When you look at the number of people who are affected, negatively affected, because they didn't get through this barrier to making literacy transparent, which, by the way, letter transparency, literacy, right? The letters have become transparent. They can communicate both ways through them. All right. If you look at the collateral effects on their lives, it seems to us that learning to read is engendering the nation's greatest learning disability. It's disabling the learning of more people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, that is not generally well understood at all. And yet, I mean, it is in circles that you run, but to parents and teachers, the idea that the difficulty a child experiences in a protracted, learning to read process can be learning disabling to them. Right.
And to the whole nation. I mean, and to me, I mean, learning to read, well, all learning in school isn't just about learning stuff. It's also learning to learn. And a highly proficient reader has learned how to learn. They've learned how to learn from their reading, to learn from their writing, how to, a really powerfully literate person understands things about the structure of knowledge and information and story and conversation. And all of that becomes an array of tools for continued learning and continual ability to respond to and manipulate their environment writ large.
Yeah. Korzybski and epistemics all across the boundary there, yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
And what they don't understand, they know how to learn
exactly
into what it is they want to learn about.
Right. I mean, that's kind of critical. I mean, we're at that right now with the high school conversation is, we've got to fix high schools. And some of the conversation is make the courses more rigorous, whatever that means. So their idea of rigor is probably more information. When I say their, I mean some people's idea of rigor is probably more information. My idea of rigor is deeper understanding. And the original writings on standards-focused education improvement, which kind of started this snowball, talked about standards that promoted deep understandings. It didn't talk about standards that aligned instruction with assessment or all of that. It simply said these are the standards that guide instruction that will foster deeper understandings. We've lost sight of that.
I have
Oh,
one
well.
more question and we'll wrap it. Can you speak to the breadth of the NEA as this massive organization? Just a quick, how many teachers are?
Oh my God.
the NEA?
Well,
Just a light touch on
yeah, okay,
that.
yeah. Well, first of all, we have, I think, 2.7 million members at this point. Only a percentage of those are teachers. It also includes retired teachers and who are often still teaching or tutoring, and it includes our what we call education support professionals, who are bus drivers, nurses, and so forth.
One more second. When you say we,
Oh,
can you say
NEA.
I'm thinking of
Yeah, I
can
should
you
say NEA. I will say NEA, and I actually am
Thank you.
supposed to. The communications people would be all over me. So yeah, NEA includes regular classroom teachers, retired teachers, education support professionals like nurses, school nurses, bus drivers, cafeteria workers. We have student members, and we have people on the faculty in higher education. So it's a huge range of people. And then the teachers themselves, of course, are a huge range of people. We represent, I believe, about 2/3 of the teachers in this country. So it's huge, and we do an enormous amount of policy work at both the state and the national level, and we do a lot of work supporting our state and local affiliates, especially our state affiliates, vis-a-vis policy. So they frequently will have state legislation, and they'll come to us and say, who else has this? How do they deal with it? What can we do? And so forth. So that's a large part of what we do. We're very concerned about things like health benefits and so forth because our members are concerned about those. So the things that we are involved in are vast. In my department, we have what we call the content people, math, social studies, science, early childhood, and the assessment people, literacy. But, we have a whole department on teacher quality, a whole department on school quality, a department on human and civil rights, which is a major thrust. We have a huge initiative that's guiding all of our work. My work is now subsumed under the Closing the Achievement Gap initiative, which makes sense to me because that's the reading work that needs to be done. And how do you close the achievement gap? To me, the main way you do it is improve students' reading achievement. That's critical. Even some students' math achievement is linked to their lack of literacy abilities. So I like that notion. We try to make our work come together across various departments. And currently, across our departments, we're working hard on high school reform and adolescent literacy.
Excellent. If you're okay with it, as the lights cool us down a little bit, I'd keep talking about a couple of things.
Sure,
All right.
fine.
I just
And you can turn that on if you want.